Chapter 13 The White Magnolie. Worth told Louis Scarra he needn't go home for a bed this night. No use doing that. It was a good ways out there through the woods after dark. Here was room on his own bed. Why didn't he sleep here and go on home tomorrow by daylight? And Louis said he might take him up on it. Worth nodded his beard. It did him good that the younger man came in so often. These tree-slashing and burning squatters he couldn't go, but Louis was a woodsy like himself. He relished it when they sat back together and lighted up their clays and talked. Wyatt and Jenny would pull up stools and listen. Last week Louis showed Wyatt how to make him a gigging light and spear. Today he threw down a spotted doe fawn. He had knocked over the head for Sayward to make a fawn roast. Oh, he wasn't a bad fellow for one raised by the Indians, so long as you didn't give him fire to eat. This afternoon, when Sully kept at Jenny and Asha to go visiting the McWhirters, like they planned, he said he'd go along through the woods for company. Sully and Asha came home about dark. "What's Jenny?" Worth wanted to know. Sully looked up meaningly at Asha. "Him and her run off from us," Asha bawled in her heavy voice. Worth looked in the fire. There were things he wanted to ask about this, but he felt uneasy in front of Sayward. He ate his supper, and when it got late and they hadn't come, he tapped his clay bowl and went outside. It must be close to full moon. A faint, ghostly light drifted like fine smoke under the trees. He walked down the path to the river, where he could look out. The moon lay upside down like a gold sovereign in the water, and all the little rifles threw off yellow sparks. Yes, tomorrow night would be full moon, and he didn't know as he liked it. The old saying stuck in his mind. Women were dull in the dark of the moon, but when the moon was full they were bold and free. "I'm a-goin' to bed," he told them gruffly. When he came back to the cabin, "You-uns better go too." Maybe after dark they went to the Harbisons. Wyatt stuck up for Louis. "I expect," Sayward said easily, "they're just afraid to come in while it has light in the cabin." The fire had hardly died down to coals when you could hear them nibbling on the latch string like a pair of wary young coons on the bait in one of Wyatt's snares. They came in on their toes. "You can stay," Jenny urged him, whispering. "Pappy said so." Louis took the knife from his belt, untied his moccasin strings, and he was ready for bed, but Jenny had to stoop at the fire and scrape ashes over the red coals till darkness swallowed her up. Then you could hear her taking down her hair and knotting it in braids, slipping off her short gown and feeling around in the darkness for her bedgown, till she found it and pulled it down over her and crawled in beside Sayward. Worth lay on his back listening to the whippoorwill and thinking over many things before he could sleep tonight. It took something like this, he expected, to make him see he had another girl big enough for men to pester. Oh, he had little against his bedfellow. You couldn't help it if the Delawares took you when you were a little tyke and brought you up. Louis had his good points. He even stuck up for Simon Girty that every white person hated, saying he knew of Girty to buy off. Plenty white boys the Indians had slaving for them, and to trade them off to the British. No, it wasn't his living with the Indians he had against Louis Scarra. It was his itchy foot. Once a man had such, it itched him all his life, and there was no help for it. It would itch to go from here off yonder, and once it got there, it would itch for some other place. Nothing likely but the berry hole would cure it. Louis might reckon he was giving up and settling down, but an itchy foot wouldn't let him. If nothing else worked on him, the settlers would come in, the game and woods would move out, and a woodsy would have to move out with them. Didn't he know? Wasn't he, like Louis, nigh onto 20 years back? Couldn't he see Jerry now as he had seen her that first time along the Conestoga, young, white-skinned, and pretty as Jenny today? Hadn't Jerry's folks fought her for taking up with a woodsy like he was? He hadn't much use for them then, but he could see their side now. They wanted to spare their young one from being dragged off to some lonesome tract in the woods, where they would never lay eyes on her again. But off to the woods she would go. And now, where was she? If she had Mam or Pap left, they didn't even know she was dead and buried. When her birth time came around, like as not, one gray head would say to the other, "Jerry's 39 years old today. Wonder where she's at now." They wouldn't reckon she was still 37, lying deep in the black muck of this northwest land. He hadn't liked much the time she had lit off from home when he went back to Wayne's army, but he was glad for it now. It gave her a visit with her folks, the only one she ever had. He recollected how little Jenny had cried when he took them back to the woods, but if Jerry shed any tears, she had done it in secret. Now if Louis wanted a woman, Worth would like to see him get one, but he wasn't anxious for Jenny to take the white-faced girl's place out in that lonesome cabin. Asha was the better woman for him if he only knew it. Asha took after his mother, who had Monzi blood, and her bare feet had tramped behind his father any place it pleased him to wander. Oh, he knew Louis took no more notice of Asha than of little Sully. These young fellows never would listen. Marrying wasn't like what you expected when you were young and foolish as a gander snipe. Once you were married, you stayed married, unless one of you died or run off. And young ones came thick as squirrels on a hickory. A man and woman were a long time married, but it didn't take long to get started. First thing you'd know, they'd be together. His beard tightened in the darkness. He would put his foot down on this. He'd talk plain to Sayward in the morning, but next day, when he called her out of the cabin, it wasn't easy as he had figured. You can tell Jenny he stormed, looking the other way. She's too mortal young to be a sparkin', and if she wa'n't, I still wouldn't want her a livin' way out somewhar in the bush by her lonesome. Then he went off with his bag and rifle. He wasn't going for game today. This was summertime, and they had a fresh meat. He was out to dig sang. However far he'd have to go for it. He had dug out plenty hereabouts. The whole cabin was strung up with the drying roots. Sayward felt for her father. He couldn't meet her eye, but had to go right off. Oh, he knew well enough who it was had first taken in this Louis Scurra, and listened to his hunting stories, and hefted his curly maple sporting rifle, and even gone out with his own frow and auger, and fixed up that old cabin in the sumac till it was something more than for a copper snake to live in. Yes, Worth knew who had egged this thing on, and now he was running off and telling her she had to break it up. That was easier said than done, Sayward thought, as she read up the trencher. You couldn't pen up humans in different coops like they did gypsy fowl back in Pennsylvania. Humans were free as wild pigeons in the woods. You could talk all day to a young red-breast cock or a gray-breast hen sitting up on a limb, but they would mate their own selves when the notion took them, and likely it would be deep in the woods somewhere far from your eyes and hearing. Oh, she would tell Jenny what her father had said. Let Jenny think her jealous if she wanted to. But today, when Jenny came back from walking home a short piece with Louis, she looked too mortal sweet to heart-scald right now. The last few days Jenny had come out like the Juneberry, that is only slim and pale one day, and the next is all blossoms and sightlier than anything else in the woods. Only Jenny's skin was nearer like the tulip laurel that some call the white magnolia. She came back floating along the path like milkweed down. She could hardly have known what she was doing, for without being told she took the bedding out on the bushes to air. Somewhere out there she swung on a creeper, and her voice kept lifting from the woods, fresh as a bob-white back in a Conestoga meadow. Oh, the year was a-risin' so bright and clear, and the young gal sot in the old woman's cheer. It was too far to know what the verse was about, but when she got to the chorus again, her voice sang out, and you could catch every word. Oh, the year was a-risin' so bright and clear, and the young gal sot in the old woman's cheer. Sayward went to the door and stood a while looking out. The pot was waiting for her to scrub it out with soap and sand. Let it sit till she was ready. You didn't often see the woods more still. They were atop of summer now. The leaves wouldn't get any bigger or the days longer. The changing season had slowed down till it nearly stopped. Now it would stay this way a while, through the dog days when you had to watch out for mad, slobber-jawed wolves. The only leaves that moved were yonder where Jenny kept swinging on her creeper tied in a big loop for a seat, and at the end of every verse you could hear her sing out, "Oh, the year was a-risin' so bright and clear, and the young gal sot in the old woman's cheer." What was that song about? Sayward wondered. She had a notion, though she couldn't mind ever hearing it before. When Jenny came in a while later, Sayward reckoned she wasn't far off, though this time Jenny was singing another. "Oh, why have you put on your bonny blue suit? And why do you laugh so gay? I'm off to the Lancaster Street Fair, mother. I'm off to the fair, I say." But the fair don't come off till June, Michael. You can't dress now for that day. It's the May dance I'm off to, Mother, he said. It's the May dance I'm off to, I say. But the May dance is past, Michael, she said. It was over with yesterday. Then I'll go my Cousin Ellen to see. Cousin Ellen to see, I say. But Cousin Ellen's in Reading Town, Michael, and Reading Town's far away. Maybe she's back to her mansion house, Mother. Maybe she's back, I say. I fear it's another, Michael, my son, bright as a popinjay. But who would it be, mother of mine? Who would it be, I say? Tell me it ain't the gypsy maid, Michael, and this ain't your weddin' day. It's rainin', mother, you better go in, I say. Sayward's face was cruel as she bent over her black kettle, where the bare grease had blackened and fastened. Louis Scurra better be good to that. Girl, she thought, he better take care of their Jenny. God help him if he thinks he can use her as he pleases, and then run off to the English lakes, or some place, and let her sit home lonesome as the white-faced girl in his cabin. If he reckons her folks won't do anything to stop him, she would change his mind shortly. Next time he came, she would call him out in the woods, alone, and read the law off to him. If he couldn't make Jenny any happier than he did his other woman, he better leave her alone. And if ever he had an Indian lover, he had better go back and stay with her. For everybody knows an Indian lover never will give a white man up, but after seven years to the day will come back to face him with his child in her arms. It would give Jenny a turn for him to go off now, but she would over it. It had plenty men in the woods for a girl like Jenny, and most of them she expected better than Louis Scurra. Next time he came over, she would tell him, but that was a long ways off, although she didn't know it then. Chapter 14. The Little Tyke. Sayward wished Buckman Tull had kept what day it was to himself. She would rather not have known that she and her father had made this out against Louis Scurra on a Friday. The Tulls were big-head, and always had to show they knew the most. They never let you forget they had an almanac, and that it came all the way from the Bay State. Now Porteous Wheeler came from down there himself, and you'd never know it from him, but the Tulls couldn't pass the time without fetching in the day of the week. How are you this fine Friday mornin'? Buckman Tull had called out big as you please as he went by to the post. Sayward didn't mind them telling her when it was the Lord's day. The better the day, the better the deed, and washing she did on the Sabbath would be cleaner and sweeter smelling. And bleached whiter even though it had no sun handy to hang it in. But Fridays were not like other days of the week. No, Friday was the devil's day, for the Lord was massacred on it. Oh, it could be fair enough, one place, on a Friday, but other places in the world it would be black and bitter as death. Never mind, Sayward told herself, if she couldn't change the day, she would have to let it go. It appeared fair enough here in this northwest country today. Asha's axe rang out like a man's while she chopped supper wood. Jenny hummed while she roiled the leaves, soft in their beds and lugged the bedding in, and Wyatt and Sully ran off early on their chore of fetching the cows. When it got late and they didn't come in, Sayward didn't think much about it. She and the other girls pulled stools to their supper, but once it was dark, she reckoned she'd go over to the Covenhovens and see what was keeping them. Then she looked up and saw Wyatt silent and pale as tallow at the door. His bare legs were black, muddy to the knees. "Whar's Sully at?" Jenny cried at him first. "Ain't she here?" he said, but you could see the way his look went around the cabin that he didn't expect her. "Whar'd you leave her?" Sayward asked sharply. Wyatt stood just inside the doorway. He acted like he was scared to come in his own pappy's house. The cows, he said, had never been out so far. He and Sully couldn't hear a bell till they climbed atop a sharp hill. Away down on the other side, they found them in some gat brush off from the flies. But when they drove them out, the cows wouldn't make for the settlement. No, they had it in their heads to go the other way. He beat them over their stubborn horns with a club, and still they would go away from home. He promised Sully they would get fagged after a while, and then he could turn them. But she was scared to go further in the Shawnee country. He could go on with them if he wanted, she said. She would take the path back and tell Miss Covenhoven. The cows kept right on with Wyatt scrambling behind. They forded a river and wound through places he had never seen before. It was dark when he saw a light ahead. This was one of the Shawnee towns he expected. He saw a strange log barn, and a strange white man came out with a light. Wyatt asked him could he tell him where he and his cows were at. The man looked at him. He said didn't he know where he was at? This was the Covenhoven improvement, and these were their cows he had fetched home. It was Mr. Covenhoven himself. Asha jeered in her man's voice. The cows fetched you home, and you never knowed it. "Then whar's Sully?" Jenny cried. "I expect Sully can take care of her own self," Sayward said, holding her voice and face calm. "You and Asha stay here. Wyatt can eat supper. Then me and him'll go out and get her, if he can show me the way." "I can show you the way we went out," the boy said, "but I can't the way the cows brung me home." Before Wyatt got up from the table, Big John Covenhoven came stooping in the door. His wife sent him over to see if Sully had shown up. He said he'd better go along. Sayward dropped some dry candlewood and pine knots in her greasy leather apron. Wyatt lit a stick at the fireplace and went ahead. Sometimes he whirled around a pine knot or a sliver of candlewood, and sometimes a bunch of shell bark torn off on the way. More than once he stopped to make sure he wasn't turned around again. Sayward told herself that never had she seen any of this strange black woods before tonight. They went over runs and wet places, up hill and down, and up again, till Wyatt said this was the knoll he and Sully had heard the bells from. He was sure as could be, and if they couldn't find his and Sully's barefoot tracks in the soft ground, it must be the devil had his foot over them. They built a fire there atop the hill, and kept it going to guide Sully's little feet through the night. One time or another they would go to the end of the firelight. Woohoo! Sayward would send her strong call into the black woods. Sully! Wyatt would yell as if splitting his throat would fetch her in. All that answered were echoes, and that they knew was the woods mocking them. Out in the darkness they could hear the night birds and beasts going about their business like nothing had happened. The big-eared owl, some called the hill hooter, bit off his hoots calm and steady, as always, and his bared relation dragged out the last of his arrogantly. Now and then wolves howled far off, and once came a distant wail through the woods like a panther or catamount. Or it might have been only the red fox that Worth said could give you the worst scare of any beast in the woods when it wanted. Oh, the wild creatures gave no notice at all that they saw the red light of the fire up on this hill. They went prowling the rounds as if no little tyke had been lost in the woods and didn't know the way home in the dark to her pappies. It started to rain, and in her mind Sayward could see little Sully, a bedraggled mite somewhere out in this wide bush. Where was she at? She would be asking herself, and would ever she see sisters and brother again? She couldn't take her sopping wet clothes off her little body tonight, and snuggle down safe and dry in her loft bed under the roof her pappy had made with his axe, frow, and auger. No, she must crawl in a dead, hollow tree like a bear, or up a live one like a marten. Up a tree she might be safe enough, should she but recollect she is no young gabby bird that can hold on to a limb with its toes while it sleeps. If she as much as half dozed, down she might come, and if her young legs snapped like kindling, she would have to sit on a rock and wait till they came and fetched her. John Covenhoven said hadn't they better go home on account of the rain. I ain't sugar and salt, I won't melt, Sayward told him. She was all for pushing further on, but the rain put out their torches. They had to wait for daylight to look for the place Sully and Wyatt had parted, and then Wyatt couldn't find the gat brush where the cows had stood off from the flies. When they got home to the cabin, no tuckered out and briar-scratched little tyke was waiting for them, but Jenny and Asha hadn't lacked someone to talk to. When her man didn't come, Miss Covenhoven had bridled a horse and ridden over, and when he wasn't back by early dawn, she had ridden on to the tolls and harbisons to sound the alarm. The settlers answered the summons like the blowing of a great hunting horn. No church bell could have drawn them as hard as such a heartbreak thing. Jake Tench and the bound boy, almost the last to hear, were the first to come. Billy Harbison fetched his hounds and tied them to a young dogwood, from where they made it ring around the cabin. Todd Wilder rode his dun ox over with his wife on behind. A gaunt Kentucky woman came on foot with her man and her fourth baby. She was nursing it as she stepped dark as an Indian woman across the doorway. Her breast white as milk beside the brown face, her eyes deep in their hollow sockets. Little Matthias and his boy came. The MacWhirters and the McFalls tramped together through the woods with all their 5 or 6 boys, and there were some the Luckets had only heard about and never seen before. It made you feel better with so many around, Sayward thought. The littlest ones didn't know what it was all about, and ripped and tore like they were at a frolic. But the older ones stood here and yonder, quiet as could be, the boys with their pappies, the girls with their mams in the cabin. The women had lots to ask about this thing. Each time a fresh one came, they listened to the story over again, and their eyes kept stirred up and glowing. Outside the men stood in a hard knot, making men's talk, chewing off tobacco, telling of bodies they knew had been lost. Their eyes were alive in their sober faces, and now and then when one of them rubbed over his mouth with his hand, rumpling his beard if he had any, and spitting copiously, he would cast around to see if his own youngest was all right, making little a grimace to cover it up. But there was no humor in it. Jake Tench put a brighter face on them after the MacWhirters and the McFalls came. "Never you mind, Saird," he called in at the door. "Jude MacWhirter kin find a young'un for you." Now John Covenhoven couldn't find one behind his own chopping block. The men's mouths opened round to laugh at this joke on the childless Covenhovens. Judah MacWhirter had 6 or 7 living, and only God knew how many dead back in Kentucky. The women in the house laughed, too, pulling down their faces at each other, for behind the chopping log was where they told their youngest that babies came from. For a while now it was more like usual in the Luckett cabin, and out. The men told lighter stories and slapped their legs, but the woods closed around this place too thick and dark to last. It hadn't a field here nor tame bush, not a clearing or patch of sky a human could call his own. No, this cabin was owned soul and body by the great woods that ran on to the prairies by the English lakes, and to the Spanish settlements on the Illinois. Buckman Toll was the first to hear and the last to come. Billy Harbison loosed his hounds, and they were ready to start. It didn't seem they cared if Wyatt went along or not. To show them the way, they would go out in the woods and find out for themselves what happened to this young one that she didn't come home. The women crowded out of the door to watch them go. They looked like Sinclair's army, men and boys with rifles and clubs and boots and bare feet, shoe-packs and moccasins. Buckman Tull had on his soldier coat, with his horn slung over one shoulder, and it was he who took charge. "They'll fetch your young'un back," Ellen MacWhirter comforted Sayward, "if she hain't been killed by some wild creetur." But all they fetched back next day was news of a barefoot young one's track by a run. It might have been Sully's toes in the black mud, and it might have been the youngest MacWhirter's boys. At the blast of the horn, they had all run up and tramped it out before they could measure. The day after that they found nothing. Oh, where, Sayward cried in her mind, was her father? Why did he have to be off now when they needed him most? They were out of fresh meat, with all these mouths to feed, and Sully's bed in the loft was slept in by strangers. Didn't he know his favorite young one was lost out in the woods, while he wandered around, digging in the dirt for roots for the pigtail people? When he did come home, she pitied him hard. The second evening, little Hughie McFall ran in that a strange man was outside. Sayward thought one of the other women could talk to him. Then she looked up, and Worth stood in the doorway, his bag of sang roots weighting his back, his rifle in his hand. "What fetches all these folks?" he asked sternly of Jenny, who was nearest him in the crowded cabin. When she shrank back and wouldn't answer, his eyes moved on past Wyatt and Asha till he found Sayward at the fire. "Whar's Sully?" he asked louder. "She never came home with the cows," Sayward told him. He gave a start, like a beast in a trap when it gets the first lick with the club. When was this? And when Sayward told him she ain't out in the woods yet. The neighbor folks all watched him, pitying him as Sayward told the story. She had told it so often the words were worn to her tongue, like Worth's pipe stem to his teeth. Several times he groaned, and Sayward guessed he was thinking how it might have been different if he had stayed to home. She and John Covenhoven and Wyatt had done what they could that first night, but Worth could find his way through the woods like a lynx in the dark. That first night, little Sully couldn't have been far off. Now only God knew where she had wandered and to what end she had come. When she finished, he looked like he had been dram drinking. "Whar's Louis?" he wanted to know. She didn't answer. "You'd better get him." He wouldn't meet her eyes. Louis mought know, he mought a seed her. Louis Scurra came early next morning. He wore a buck tail like it was some kind of frolic. "So you wouldn't get me before," the hard look he gave Sayward said. Oh, you could see he knew he had been slighted, and now they'd had to send for him. It made him cocky as all get out. He set himself in charge and told the men why they hadn't got anywhere. It was plain Buckman Toll didn't like this. Today, Louis said, they would stretch a line with every man and boy 6 poles apart. They would whoop at each other to keep the line straight, and when somebody found a sign, Buckman Toll would blow his horn. Buckman Toll sat up and nodded. That, you could tell, satisfied him. And if they fired off their rifles, Louis went on, that would mean they had found the young one. Dead or alive, he said, looking hard at Sayward. Wouldn't they need every human they could get? Asha put to him. You could see she hankered to go along. Every last man and boy, Louis told her, but not women and girls. They were no good in the woods. They only made it harder. If women found a sign, they would run ahead and screech for the young one till it would hide if it were around. No, the place for a girl was women's work at home. Asha's black eyes burned back at him. You could tell she reckoned it easy enough to be a man and go out in the woods, whooping to keep in line and beating the bushes for a little tyke in a red dress that by this time the brush must have whipped halfways off her back. You did no whooping at women's work. No, you stooped by the fire till your face singed and your leg muscles ached, so folks got enough to eat. And you heard no horn. All you listened to was women's talk, from daylight to dark. The women hardly stirred foot outside the cabin, yet it hadn't one who didn't have her own notion why they hadn't found little Sully. Todd Wilder's woman told about a boy called Chris that had been lost in the woods back in York State. This was in the olden times. When they found him, a panther had scratched leaves over what was left of him till it would get back that way again, and that's why it took so long to find him. Then Sally Harbison was acquainted with a lost girl it took 4 years to find down in Virginia. An Indian had shot her for a deer and buried her so the whites wouldn't find out, but her grave fell in, and when they dug it up, they found the bullet in her breastbone. God help you, getting lost in the woods was a fearsome thing, old Granny McWhirter said. She had toothless gums, and on the back of her head a white knit cap that was all yellow with age, and hair grease. She was lost once herself for 48 hours. They's only one word for it. She bobbed her head, and that's lostness. Even a growled woman keeps a runnin' and stumblin' till she's wore out. The smartest man gets fogged. He can't see straight any more. He goes crazy with bein' lost. That's what he does. If he comes on a trace he tromped every day. He don't know it any more. Let him take it, and his craziness takes the wrong end. He thinks his own tracks an hour past are the tracks of some man he never seed or knowed. Let him hear man, woman, or young'un a-comin', and he runs and hides. He ain't a human no more. He's nothin' but a wild creetur. Get him home, and the whole world's turned around, end for end. The sun's in the wrong place. It rises in the west and sets in the east. The North Star's away down yonder. She knew a case once in Kentucky, pitiful to tell. A young boy was lost 17 days. They found him digging up acorns like a squirrel with its paws, and wilder than anything in the woods. He tried to bite the thumb off his own pappy and run off. Once he was home, they reckoned he would come back to his old life, but he never owned his own sister or mother. He wouldn't sleep in a bed, and he dirtied the house like a hound. What end he came to she didn't hear, but the doctors knew nothing to do for a case like that. Sometimes Granny McWhirter bobbed her cap, and worked her lips, and drew down her face at you. It's a good thing if you don't find a lost young'un. Once they are out too long, Miss McFall said, wiping her eyes. I'd as soon see them dead and buried. That's easier to stand than this waitin' around and never knowin'. But Sayward reckoned different. She wouldn't mind if their little Sully snapped at them like a pet fox for a while, just so they found her alive. She always snapped some anyhow. A little more would be of no account, and sooner never find her than see her dead and buried. So long as you never knew, you could keep on hoping, if it was a score of years. Once you saw a body put underground, that was an end to it, and to a little part inside of you that died too. How many times the horn blew that day they didn't know, for it was too far to hear. The men must have camped out somewhere in the woods that night. You could see this wasn't going to be over and done with easy like Louis Scarra thought. In the morning, Asha, Cora McWhirter, and some of the other big girls made the rounds of the improvements that had stopped to tend. They fetched back food and bedding. The men did not come back that night either, but a few nights following, when they were all down on pallets on the floor like so many logs jammed side by each at a rolling, they heard a whooping. Jenny's hands trembled so she could hardly pull on her short gown. She thought they had Sully. It was old Hugh McFall and Hen Giddings whooping before they got to the cabin, so the women and young ones wouldn't be scared. They had come back to see if the women folk were all right and the stock tended. They would take back some meal to the woods tomorrow. Saywood threw wood on the fire for light and got them rations. After their bellies were filled, they told what they knew. No, they hadn't come on the young one yet, but that Louis Scarra had a lynx eye in the woods. You needn't be out long to know he'd been raised by the Delawares. Between him and Worth, they had no need of Billy Harbison's hounds. The first day Louis found Spice Wood chewed by some other creature than a deer, for it had teeth marks on the upper side of the twig, and Worth picked up a red thread torn off by a black haw. Oh, those two could follow where you could see nothing, and every sign they came on, the young one was further and further from home. They found where she ate wild cherries and whortleberries, and where she crossed the runs. You could see her foot plain as could be in the sand. The third day they came on a nest of old leaves where she spent the night. She must have camped here more than one day, for her little feet had beaten a path in a heavy stand of timber. Now, what do you reckon she had in there? Old Hugh, who was telling it, settled himself. He blinked solemn as an owl. You'd never guess it, he said. Louis Scarra found it himself, and had Buckman Toll blow his horn. When they all came up, he took them in and asked did they see anything. So help him if there wasn't a little bitty playhouse made of sticks in that big timber. It had bark on the roof and a doorway in the middle. Inside it had a bed of leaves and a block of wood for a trencher, with a scrap off a young one's dress for a fancy trencher cloth. It even had a nosegay of flowers. Anybody could see right off a mite of a girl had done this, away back here in the wilderness, far from any human's cabin. She had made herself a little house just like her pappy's. You might reckon a big bearded fellow like Jake Tench wouldn't mind looking at such, but when Worth raised up and called out to the woods, "Sully, Sully, be you still alive?" Jake had to walk himself off in the bush. Jenny couldn't listen any more. She buried her head in the bed clothing. Asha's brown face twisted up in cruel lumps. Sayward turned hard to the fire, because, like Jake, she couldn't stop her eyes. "Sully, Sully, be you still alive?" she called out in her mind with her father. Out there in the great woods, further than any of them had ever been, except maybe one or two, their little Sully had built a playhouse to recollect how she and Wyatt and Jenny and Asha had run and played together by this cabin. Wasn't it just like her? Who but little Sully would put a nosegay in a playhouse, or make up a trencher with a fine red cloth? She was ever saying grand things that no one dared think of, but she and her grandmam Powley, who lived in a story and a half-chipped log house across the road from Grandpappy's gunsmith shop along the Conestoga. Sayward wished she could see for herself that little playhouse Sully had made. She'd give all she had if Hugh McFall and Hen Giddings would take her back with them when they went. Those men would need a woman if ever they found Sully. God knows that after all these days she would be a poor little bag of bones. She would need special waiting on. Men would not know how. But old Hugh McFall and Hen Giddings went back to the woods without saying a word. No, not a word. They went alone at daylight, and that was the last the women saw of them for a week. Once upon a time Sayward wished she had a clock. Miss Covenhoven had one, and Porteous Wheeler, the bound boy said, carried a pocket clock that struck the hours, though it was no bigger around than his fist. A clock, Sayward reckoned, was almost human, for it had face, hands, and sense to tell the time. No doubt it was a friendly face to have around, and to hear it ticking sociably through the day and night. But a human could tell time the best, for some hours were fast, and some were slow. Now you could tell nothing from Sayward's face, but the hours of this last week were the longest in all her born days. This was a time in her life she thought she would never want to go back to and live again. You would expect, Jenny said, that since they found Sully's playhouse, it wouldn't take long till they found the little tyke herself, but it didn't work out that way. No, it seemed the devil had done it like this just to work up their hopes, and then let them fall through. The men said there was a plain track of Sully going into that place, but none going out, like a pack of hounds trying to find the lost scent. They made bigger and bigger circles around, but the one cold track was all they could find. It was almost like an eagle had swooped down by her playhouse and carried her off, leaving never a sign on the ground. In worn-out bunches, these men and boys straggled back. They said they had done all mortal man could do. They had tramped the woods from Dan to Beersheba. They had tramped it further than any young one could travel on its own shanks. They had raked it with a fine-tooth comb. All they had found were horse tracks and a place where some strange Indians had made fire for the night. The young uns agone, Josie. Jude McWhirter shook his shaggy head. They ain't no use a-huntin' what ain't thar. Now, little Sully's bed up in the loft lay empty and lonesome again. Only Worth and Louis Scurra had not come back. No, they had stuck to the woods like stubborn hounds that can't be clubbed into giving up the scent. There wasn't a fresh bone or dust of meal left in the cabin, but Sayward reckoned they could make out by theirselves. The young ones could pick berries and fish the river with wang leather outlines. Wyatt could snare rabbits, and she could cut out the summer worms. Maybe, maybe, too, a body could take a rock and keep still long enough in the woods to call a turkey or kill a cock pheasant when he came strutting to his log. But the hungry young ones were glad enough to lay eyes on Louis Scurra at the cabin door one morning. Flowers sprang out on Jenny's white cheeks, though it would be an hour before she should taste the venison slung in a red summer hide on his back. No meat ever came in handier, but Sayward begrudged him sorely that it wasn't their Sully he had fetched back. Never would she forgive him that. He said he and Worth had followed the tracks of the horseback Indians till they separated and petered out. Back on the Miami River, he had to give up. But Worth wouldn't come home. No, he said he couldn't look at his cabin, now with his littlest gone. Now that he was out this far, he would keep on beating the woods for her till he reached the granddaddy of rivers. Always had Worth wanted to lay eyes on that long river, frozen in winter at one end, while the other end has flowers and palm trees on either bank. He said one man could keep his cabin in meat till he got back. Louis told her. Sayward's face was tight-lipped and cruel. She had not a word to say as she got a roast ready, for what could you say to a man who had beat the woods for your littlest sister that was likely dead, then fetched meat home for your living sisters and brother to eat? Oh, she would feed their empty bellies with smoking hot flesh till their cheeks stuck out again, but it would be bitter enough meat to her. Dinner done, she scrubbed what little she had to scrub, and took herself off by her lonesome to the woods where she could work this thing off with her legs. Everywhere she went, the trees stood around her like a great herd of dark beasts. Up and up shot the heavy butts of the live ones. Down and down, every which way on the forest floor, lay the thick, rotting butts of the dead ones. Alive or dead, they were mostly grown over with moss. The light that came down here was dim and green. All day, even in the cabin, you lived in a green light. At night, that changed. By day, you looked paler than you really were. By night, the fire gave you a ruddy glow. She always waited for night-time, when little Sully had looked to be ailing. Likely it was only the wood's light. By firelight she would be well again. Oh, it was a cruel thing for the trees to do this to a little girl who had never harmed them more than to shinny up their branches or swing on a creeper. Some claimed the trees were soft-hearted as humans. They said the pole of the cross had been cut from pine, and that's why the pine was always bleeding. The crosspiece, they claimed, was from quaking ash. The quaking ash has shook ever since, and never can it live now more than the 33 years of the Lord. Likely as not, Sayward told herself, a tree might tremble and bleed for the Son of the Almighty, who could heave it out by its roots with his breath or smack it down with his thunder. But neither pine nor quaking ash would give a height for a poor little girl body wandering around lost in the woods, crying for her sisters and pappy, who never came to answer. And the birds and beasts would be as bad. Oh, she heard Jenny sing a catch once, where the birds and beasts covered up the lost babes in the woods with leaves. But that was just a pretty song. Any woodsy knew that the corbies would sit around in a ring waiting to pick out the poor little babes in the woods' eyes. And if any beast covered them up with leaves, it would be the panther, so he could come back and munch at their starved little hams another day. Back along the Conestoga, the trees seemed tame enough. Out here they were wild trees. Even in the daytime you could feel something was watching you. When you went through the woods, it followed sly as a fox and stealthily as a Shawnee. Leave your cabin for a season, and it would choke it around with brush. Likely you would find trees growing out of your bed when you got back. Once Sayward thought she heard voices, but it was only beetles in the air. The sound came stronger when she got to the rifles. Far off she swore she could hear Sully calling, "Sardy, Pappy," her little voice came. Sayward knew it was no more than river water slopping and gargling over logs and stones, but it sounded real enough to make the sweat come and her knees to tremble. She let her legs go till she reckoned she had tramped far enough. First thing she knew, she'd be lost like Sully. Back along the river, she couldn't shut out those voices. Even the place was such as a little tyke like Sully would hanker to play in. Fern grew like a garden all over the ground. You couldn't walk without it, feeling soft and smelling sweet against your leg. Yonder was a row of fat pines you didn't often lay eyes on in this hardwood country. Then she stood stock still. It wasn't water voices she heard. A path wound here, worn by somebody's feet. It led straight under the dark of the pines. Out at the other end, where the sun shone golden on the river, somebody was lying on the brown pine needles. Now she saw it was a girl and a man. Still as a deer she stood there watching. Then sober and silent-footed she went back to the cabin. Chapter 15. Jenny's Wide, Wide World. Sayward's bare toes gripped the sill log as she stood in the doorway. The cabin looked to be empty. Wyatt must have gone after the cows, but she knew Asha lay in her bed. She could see the loft boards that never would lay quite flat, rocking a little on their joists. "Ewa Ailin," she called calmly, blowing up the ashes and laying on a stick or two so she wouldn't have to make fresh fire. Asha didn't give her an answer. She didn't need to, for Sayward knew she was sulling. Asha didn't like it that Jenny and Louie had gone off by themselves in the woods. Well, she would have to learn that two's company and three's a crowd. Sayward let her body down on the wall bench. Once Miss Covenhoven had asked her if she wasn't tired, and Sayward had puzzled over it a long time afterward. If ever she was tired, she never knew it. Sometimes it felt good to sit down. It did today. She told herself she must have tramped further than she thought, but all the time she knew what it was. They had run from the wolf into the bear, and now the wolf had caught up to them again. You could easy tell, she told herself harshly, that God Almighty was a man. He had favored man plenty when he made him up out of a fistful of dust and spittle. A man had no apron strings for things to get tied to. No, a man could gander around and have his pleasure and then wander off free as a hawk wherever he had a mind to. He could forget it by tomorrow and deny it a few months hence, but never could a woman deny it. She had to stay at home and take care what came of it. She couldn't hope to outsmart God Almighty. No, it was the man who was usually a willin, and the woman a sorryin. "What day have ye sought to get married?" she asked the pair when they came in later. There was a quick sound from the loft as Asha came down the ladder, and Louis shot a sharp look at Sayward, with his blue eyes that could blaze up like a sheet of wildfire. Sayward looked back at him, so steady he went for a coal to light his pipe. Though anybody with eyes could see it was smoking. "I ain't give it a thought," he said, flushing up. "It hasn't a squire or missionary nigher than the Ohio. You mought boat Jenny down." Sayward reckoned. "I don't allow she would mind." Long afterward, Sayward was to remember the blinding look Jenny flashed her, and the cruel look from Asha. No, you couldn't please two at one time, and you couldn't tell Asha you'd rather it had been she. It wasn't what you'd rather in this world. If Jenny would have him fair or cloudy, she'd better have him fair. She would have liked to say a word to Louis Scurra before he went off with his taken bride. He must recollect that Jenny was a girl of tender age, while he was a grown man. Let him flare up at that all he liked. Let him say, "Who's a-doin' this, you or me?" She was not scared of him, but maybe the littlest said, the less Jenny might have to put up with. You could but make trouble for a girl once she was some man's woman. From that time on she had to go it herself. When Sayward was a little tyke, she thought the woods robins cruel for turning their backs on a young bird, fresh out of the nest. Lonesome by itself in some strange bush, they'd let it sit through the long dark of the first nights, while the old ones roosted safe and high in the home tree. But when she got older, Sayward reckoned the woods robins knew what they were doing. Each day Jenny was gone, Sayward took herself down to the river. She told herself she wasn't fretting over Jenny. No such thing. She just wondered where Jenny was now. When was she comin' back? And would she come a-singin' or a-weeping? What she went for was mostly to feel the breeze. The river was the only high road through the woods there was, and the wind knew it. Things with wings knew it too. Ducks flew up and down like bullets. Forest beasts had to cross it. Once she saw a bear splash over, and once a fawn with a black wolf after. All the time the river flowed calm and slow. Specks of foam were liver marks on its face, but it kept its mind to itself. You couldn't tell what the river was thinking. Deep and shut-mouthed it was, like most of these swarthy bodies. Oh, but wasn't drowning a pitiful way for a young girl to die? Not many brides in this world got a wedding trip. Jenny told herself as she helped pole the boat home. Her man stood up to pull it from its hind end. Jenny's pole was but light poplar that would callous her white hands no more than it had to. Louis's was a long hickory pole, stouter than iron. When he heaved it back through his hands, she could hear the water churn like a flood tide under the front end. Sometimes in deep water he laid down his pole. Jenny could not help him then, for he had whittled out only one paddle. They had floated light as a leaf down this river, down past the forks, down past where the little river came in, down past the stockade, to the Ohio, where water was plenty as at the English lakes, and the settlements thick as blackberries. She and Louis had need only to pole the 5 or 6 days back, for the river had carried them down. They were almost home now. That sweet chimney smoke you could smell here on the water came from Buckman Toll's cabin, hid yonder in the woods. You couldn't see from the trees that any humans lived on the upper reaches of this river. You could only hear Billy Harbison's hounds bang, and the guinea hens of Buckman's younger sister, Idie, making like a rusty grindstone, turning over and over, and couldn't stop. They hadn't far to go now. Never in her whole life before had Jenny spent a night without her sisters and brother. Now she could hardly wait to see them again. Never had they laid eyes on Louis Scurra's wife. No, she was only plain Jenny Luckett then. She expected she had better lay down her pole and put on her fine green stockings and her cowhide shoes. They were getting mighty nigh to home now. Behind her were the pines and ferns of her secret place. This here pied old buttonwood she had surely seen before, and yonder waterlogged butt was the one she and Wyatt had once fished behind, or her eyes were a liar. Her pappy's cabin wasn't far off from here, just around the bend, and yonder through the woods a piece it stood, if it hadn't burned down or been moved while she was off getting married. It wasn't more than a whoop and a holler. If she let out her voice, they might hear her by the fire. "Hesh up," Sayward would turn on the young ones. "That sounds like our Jenny a-singin'." She pulled on her fine stockings, and her eyes felt bright as a coon's. She didn't know how Louis would take it. She better hum a little first. He might growl this was no way for a married woman to come home. But he paid her no attention, and her voice pitched out high and strong over the water. Oh, the year was a-risin' so bright and clear, and the young gal sot in the old woman's cheer. Some kind of body was up there by the landing log. It ran off and came back with another. They stood stock still as wild things, watching this boat poling up the river. Jenny's eyes moistened. She would know them anywhere in this wide world. They were Asha, her own brown girl of a sister, and that rascal of a brother, with his shagbark hair falling down his shoulders and back and standing up in front like a corn shock. Better had he not go north into scalping country with a head of hair like that, for he was the only brother she had living, and never now could she get another. Where was her oldest sister? She hoped nothing had happened to that Sayward while she was away. Once she had thought it was Sayward was against her, for never did she hear her oldest sister say a word for Louis Scurra. Then that day she had said, "You mought boat Jenny down. I don't allow she would mind." Oh, she wouldn't mind, would she? Why, she wouldn't have missed this wedding trip for all the skins in George Roebuck's store. She had gone out of these woods. She had been to the settlements of the Ohio. She had seen the wide, wide world again. That's what she had. And likely Louis wouldn't have thought of it had it not been for that yellow-headed bouncer of a sister she could see now taking her time through the trees. All she could wish for on top of this would be her pappy leaning on his rifle, and little Sully running down the bank, hollering what had Jenny fetched her. Only last night in their camp she lay feeling it a sin to be so happy married, while her littlest tyke of a sister was still lost somewhere out in the woods, like a young gabby bird that fell out of its nest and never could find its way back. But she daren't sniffle now. They'd expect something was wrong betwixt her and Louis. Here was Wyatt waiting out to catch the front end and swing it up easy to the log so she could land dry-footed as a lady. And there was Asha, with a hard mouth, staring at her fine green cotton stockings and her cowhide shoes. Now they all stood together on the bank, sisters and brother looking at her, and she proudly at them. Never Jenny thought had she felt so close as now when her man stood between them. "Must say you're a-looking good," Sayward made cheerful talk. "You'd reckon I'd break the way Louis took care o' me," Jenny said shyly, looking back at him. "Are you married now?" Wyatt was watching her close. "What do you expect they went off together for?" Asha jeered, but her eyes were cool. "Then your name ain't like ourn. You're Jenny Scurra." Oh, you could see she was more in Wyatt's eyes now. The path to the cabin was narrower than Jenny remembered. They had to walk Indian file down to the point she told them. "They's a street so wide it has footpaths on every side, and a middle for carts. They even got the stumps out. Ain't the path good enough for you now that you went to the settlements?" Asha mocked her. Something flew up in Jenny. She would show Asha the path was good enough to race her back to the cabin, even if she had shoes on, but she must recollect she was no giddy goose cap any more. No, she was a married woman now. When they got to the cabin, she sat down politely, like it was a strange house, and she company. When Sayward started to get supper, she got up to do for her man. Her hands helped with the fire, and lugged in fresh water, and put it on to boil. When there was nothing more to do, she fetched in her and Louis's plunder from the boat. "You can put it thar," Sayward said, pointing to Worth's unused bed. Jenny turned her face from Asha's hard stare. She could feel her face flush up at putting her and Louis's things together, on a bed in front of all. Halfway through supper, Jake Tench and the bound boy came. Jake said he knew they were home. Somebody had seen what looked like a bride and bridegroom pulling up the river. He kept them all laughing and Jenny in blushes. He told Louis now was the time for him to come to the aid of his country. All he had to do was feed himself gunpowder, and it would be a soldier boy. Old Jake played the fool from first to last. Even Asha forgot her sulling ways, trying to keep her face straight. But the bound boy's eyes, sad and brown as a hound's, never stopped casting up across the trencher to Jenny that she had gone off and given herself to another. Jenny had heard how great folks sat at the table long after their eating was done. Sayward would never stand for that before. If anybody wanted to talk, they could go somewhere else so she could read off the trencher. But this was almost like a wedding night, and Sayward said nothing while Louis told what he saw down the river. He told it so good you could see the cabins at the forks as if you were there, and the tavern where the little river came in. But these, he said, were only tomahawk settlements to the town on the point of the Ohio. It had cleared fields to make a good-sized prairie, and houses in rows like an Indian village. He reckoned at first it must be a public day, for all the women and girls were sitting out in clean aprons on their street porches. He saw young ones with neat leather shoes and a big wig taking the air in a scallop-rimmed hat, blue coat, yellow breeches, and silver knee and shoe buckles. A stranger hearing him tell it would have thought Louis had boated down there all by himself. The only time Louis let on that another went along was when he broke off at some marvel to say, "You can ask Jenny thar," but it was all right. For everybody knew what Louis had gone down the river for, and who had gone with him. Jenny was proud just to hear her name called by him, and to say once in a while, "It's true as gospel," or "God can strike me dead on this spot." While he talked, Jenny kept her eyes from the two beds in the cabin. That had been her father's bed, and this one hers and Sayward's, but she would not sleep with Sayward now. No, she was something in this house tonight she never was before. All evening it lay in the back of her mind, never coming out, and yet softly pleasing as a piece of sorghum taffy, tucked back under her tongue. She could forget about it and sit here and listen, and after a while such a mortal sweetness would come out all by itself she could hardly stand it. Ever since she had been a little tyke, she had liked to keep something pleasant back in the mind like this, something on ahead and still to come, but never had it tasted honeyed as this time. Louis was telling how he wished he had fetched back a little gimcrack of quicksilver he had seen. It was painted with a fine brush, so it would tell the heat and frost. It was no earthly use, for any human that isn't daft can tell for himself if the day is hot or cold, but he could have traded it to the Indians when he got tired of it. What he'd like to keep for himself was a brandy bottle with a ripe peach in it. How it got in nobody knew, for the peach was many times bigger than the neck of the bottle. A doctor kept it in the window of his chemist's shop so all could see it when they walked by. Oh, that big peach in a bottle was too deep for most, but Louis figured it out on the way home. The sharp doctor had put the bottle neck over the peach when it was a little green fellow. Then he had tied the bottle to the tree for the peach to fill out inside the glass. Oh, Louis could reel off what he saw when he had a mind to. Jenny felt warmed by the drone of his voice. The firelight played over these home logs and faces. It was good to be off, but it was good to be home again. The night turned late. Some of them were yawning. Jake and the bound boy climbed up with Wyatt to sleep in the loft. Sayward and Asha went out in their short gowns and back in their bedgowns, popping in bed quick as they could. While they were out, Louis had pulled off his buckskins and crawled under the light bedding where Jenny showed him, but she was too shy to follow him right off for the first time in her pappy's cabin. She kept down by the firelight, mending the tears in his buckskins. Between the slow stitches of Wang she let her eyes fall soft on every chink, and Peg she knew so well. Her father's old hunting frock and Sully's little patched bedgown still hung with the other clothing on the pins around the logs. Yonder was her three-legged stool with the signs she had carved on it, and there was the 5-round ladder she had climbed plenty times to the loft. "Hain't you a-comin' to bed at all?" After a while Louis flared out at her. "You won't want to get up in the mornin'." Jenny knew there was no putting this thing off any more. It was something had to be done. She could tell by their breathing that Asha and Sayward were still awake. The others must be too, for no snores came from the loft. She put her awl and Wang's away. Stealthily she pushed the fire coals apart to make less light. Then she lit a splinter of candle wood, and when she came back in the cabin she was barefoot and in her bedgown. She set her shoes and stockings up on a stool off the dirt floor. Softly she nudged Louis to get over so she could lie at the outside, for she must be up and dressed before a man stirred. Now she wished she hadn't had him make all this noise. She should have stepped over him tonight and slept yonder against the logs and chinking. The whippoorwill kept calling to her all the night. She reckoned it must be the whippoorwill kept her awake, or else she had slept out in camp so long she couldn't sleep under a roof again. When she closed her eyes, she thought she was still in the boat, or standing back in the grand room they were married in. The floor was of shaved boards. Shaved boards and doors nearly covered the fireplace side of the room. The wood was stained brown, and it polished till you could see the candles in it. It had a high desk in that room, with an iron noggin of ink and a quill in it. It couldn't have been either cooking or sleeping room, for there wasn't a pot on the hearth, or a bed to sleep in. Even Louis couldn't lay his tongue on the right word to call that room, but they stood up in it, just as big and pert as if they knew. Louis in his buckskins, and she in her fine new green stockings and cowhide shoes. She wished Sayward could have laid eyes on them then, for Sayward had never heard a bride and bridegroom say the solemn vows a dominie told them. She pitied her oldest sister lying over there in bed, with nobody to sleep with but Asha. Oh, Sayward never knew what it was to wake up at night, with your man close beside you, and maybe his arm slung over you in his sleep, to tell you that if a bear or Indian came along, no harm would befall you. She pitied Wyatt and Asha too. Never hardly since they could remember had they been out of these woods like she had. No, they had never seen a blackamoor slave, wench, or Quaker, with temple spectacles on his face. If they went in a house that had no logs inside, they would be dumbfounded. That's what they'd be. They wouldn't know what to make of a room that had no joists or loft boards. The light from a whale oil lamp at night would mighty near blind them at first, so it would, and if they saw a house with real glass window lights, they would be liable to butt their heads against one like a wild pigeon, not knowing that anything but a hole was there. She pitied any human tonight that wasn't lucky as she was. She had got herself a man, one that would keep her sisters and brother in meat till their father got home. She had a wedding trip. She had seen the wide, wide world again. Now tomorrow she and Louis would set up keeping house for themselves in their own cabin. Then her happiness better hold still for a while, for she couldn't hold any more. She would have her own roof over her head, her own bed for her and her man to sleep in, and her own place where she would keep that precious thing, fire, always smoldering under the ashes to blow up when she wanted to cook her man any tidbit his palate hankered for. Not many were lucky to start off married life with as much as she had. Her cabin was all built, and her father had unknowingly fixed it up with his own frow and auger. She had 2 pots and trammels to hang them on. Louis had traded English silver for them, the same place he got her cowhide shoes and green stockings. In one of her pots were the lucky salt and pepper she'd carry first over her own door-sill. She had a bag of meal, and Sayward, she knew, would give them more bedding when the nights started to freshen. For the rest, the woods were there for the getting. It would not take her man long to whittle out quiches or noggins, maybe even 2 tined sassafras forks. She herself would go trapsing through the woods for gourds, for water dippers, and to hold grease and such. A few good clips with the axe would give all the clean plates they needed. Louis said he knew a chunk of soapstone he could fetch home and cut legs in with his knife. Now, soapstone makes the best griddle of all. Frying meat or meal will not stick to it, and when the snow started to fly, she expected he would tan them a bare skin to lay on the dirt floor in front of the fire. Oh, her and him would make their cabin a snug nest for themselves, and for any young one they might find behind their chopping log some morning late next spring. Chapter 16. Public Day. A year to the month that Sully was lost in, they heard about Worth. A keel boat pusher fetched the word up the Ohio. A packer left it at George Roebuck's. Talk reached the Luckett cabin that Worth was dead, and some that Worth was living. Sayward took her time and went about her business. This would keep. When her sang roots were dried, she took a grist of them in her apron and went to the post. It was just her luck that George Roebuck had gone to Shawnee Town looking for a pair of fussels stolen from his warehouse cabin. The bound boy was waiting on customers. He weighed up Sayward's roots. Then he put the salt she wanted on the steel yards, tapping the weight along the beam. Nobody had dared to walk across the puncheons while George Roebuck was at the steel yards, and the bound boy acted big as the trader. Twice he scraped salt off, and once he put a pinch of the precious stuff back on. And that's all Sayward got for her pains. "I can't tell ya about your pappy," the bound boy said. "Is he a livin' or dead?" Sayward wanted to know. "I can't tell ya." Will Beagle kept saying, "George said he wanted to tell you hisself. You can see him at the frolic." Sayward held out her apron for the salt. "He better stop by the cabin then," she told him with spirit. "We ain't intendin' to go out celebratin' with our pap dead and buried." The bound boy scraped up a few of the white grains he had spilled and licked them off his fingers. "You can go," he said without looking at her, "but don't give out I said anything." Sayward's face did not change. Some said the settlement was giving itself airs already, taking notice of a public day in the middle of summer, when work was plenty. But if they would give a frolic for Independence Day, Sayward wouldn't have liked to be the one to stay away. She told Asha that night they were going, and Asha was so tickled she wouldn't give up till Sayward tried something Sally Withers told her. You had to swallow a dry thimbleful of salt before you went to bed. Then whoever gave you a drink of water in your dream, that would be your man. I got nothin' for that, Sayward said. Salt's too high and scarce for such foolishness. But Asha kept after her till she let her put some in her mouth, and now she hadn't dared drink any water till morning. Sometime during the night she woke up with a powerful thirst. She thought it was some place else. Everything stood out like real. She dreamed they were all in a stockade, dying like dogs for water. Sully and Worth lay with them, and all their guts were dry as powder, but none could go out with the kettle, for the Indians lay outside. A soldier in a coonskin cap, with 3 brass rings, cut himself a long Joe Pye weed. He stuck that reed through a knot hole, and sucked water from the run. When he was sucked full, he motioned to Sayward she could drink from his reed. Then she looked up and saw it was Porteous Wheeler. Sayward told herself she would say nothing in the morning to Asha about this. It just went to show how daft a dream could be, for the Bay State lawyer was the last one she thought of when she was in her right senses. Never had she passed a word with him. Folks called him the Solitary on account of him living out in the bush by his lonesome. Most times you couldn't get any more talk out of him than a deaf and dumb mute. But they said he came of a fine family, and when Jake Tench got him dram drinking, the bound boy said he could recite anything he had a mind to out of the Bible, the poetry books, or the Constitution. Jake said they were going to grease him up for a speech on Independence Day. The morning of the frolic, the three Lucketts went down the path in a single file from the cabin. Wyatt tramped ahead, but when they came in sight of the folks gathered in Toll's shellbark grove, he hung back like Worth used to do. Sayward felt for him. Only a boy, he acted like he had lived in the woods longer than a lamprey eel in the mud, and never could he learn how to be sociable with his fellows. Now it was no trouble at all for her. She took after her mother's side of the house, and liked neighbors nigher than the distance of a gunshot. She had almost forgotten how it felt to get among a passel of folks on pleasure bent. The young ones were making high jack all over the place, wrestling and fighting, racing and waiting, swinging on creepers, every last one yelling at the other, and none listening. Some of the men were pulling a flag up on a high hickory limb. Others were laying meat over a pit of white oak coals to roast. This was one time, they said, when the he's would show that the she's how to cook. The women didn't mind. They were glad to get out of it for once and go off to themselves yonder on some logs, with nothing to do but lay their littlest ones on patches of moss and swap news among themselves. Oh, this, Sayward told herself, was the only time the woods looked pretty to her. Sooner would she see colored shirts and short gowns among the green than any buck's flag, sooner hear all these young ones fighting and swearing than the fattest gray moose cracking through the brush, sooner smell the soft pickled smell of human victuals in covered baskets and buckets mixed with the smell of the woods than a whole cabin-side curing with beaver, otter, and silver fox skins. Jenny hadn't come as yet. Sayward wondered if Louis could be mean enough not to fetch her. She couldn't see Jake Tench either. George Roebuck was here, but Sayward wouldn't run after him. She had gone to him once. Now let him come to her, for he would want to tell it as bad as she would want to hear. For a long while she sat with the women, giving talk and taking it. When she looked up, George Roebuck was coming her way. "I had news from your pappy, Saird," he said, with the grave slant of his eyelids that meant serious talk, and the women hushed their gabbing, and the littlest ones crying to listen. As a rule, the trader was short-winded in his post, but he took his time now with all the women watching. This wasn't business, but a time to be sociable. He had his leather apron off for Independence Day, and blue stockings on like gentry. He wasn't a big man when you stood beside him. It was his bearing that made him seem so. He's away back at the French settlements on the Mississippi. He's a livin' then, Sayward nodded. The trader's voice sounded a little nettled, that she took it so calm. He sent word for you to write him a letter. He wants to know how you all are, and did you ever hear from your Sully? He'll pay the postage. I got the place he's at marked down in my ledger. All you need to do is tell him if you need anything, and he'll see that you get it. Worth must be a-doin' purty good out are. Flora Greer put to him. He's skinnin' plenty wild bulls, they say, the trader answered shortly and walked off. It was strange, Sayward pondered, after he was gone, how just word from her father fetched him up in front of her eyes. Away off yonder he was with his rifle, slouching in his gray buckskins, through the street of the French settlements, by that granddaddy of rivers that was mighty far to see across, and dark as thunder on the other side were those herds of wild bulls that some call buffalo. A curious kind of beast that didn't get up first behind and then in front like other cattle, but jumped to its all four legs from the ground. He must be skinning more wild bulls than was good for him, Sayward thought, to send word for her to write him a letter. Certain he ought to mind that Jerry had never got further with her and Jenny than the alphabet. This was way back in Pennsylvania. More than once he had watched them on the sunny side of the old cabin where his hound Rex used to lie. Jerry would chase the hound off and write a pot hook in the dust with her finger. When Sayward and Jenny had learned it by heart, she would rub it smooth and write another. The little G, Sayward minded, had a long tail like a squirrel, and so had some of the others. This tail curled back one way and that tail another. A body had to be smart to tell them right off and to call out when an S had a tail up and down and when it hadn't. The printed S was easier to mind because it looked like a trammel. The little E was only the cipher 3 turned around. Some of the big letters looked mighty foreign and hard to name, but Jerry knew them all. She could make that old hound's bed talk, with fine spelling and even rhymes when she had a mind to. Yes, Worth must be getting up in the world to send such word to her. Perhaps he had taken some French woman for a wife, and was shamed to own up in front of her that his oldest girl couldn't spell out a letter. Well, in that case, she would fool him. Just sitting here, she could rig out in her mind a letter she would get somebody to write for her. She would make it read fine as one of George Roebuck's that the bound boy talked about. I seek myself and take my quill in hand to write you the news. Billy Harbison promised Wyatt a hound. Pup next time his bitch came around. Asha is growed up. You wouldn't hardly know her. Did you hear out where you're at that Jenny has a man? I guess you know who. She was married lawful down at the Ohio settlements. I am good as usual. Your obedient servant, Sayward Luckett. By hockey day, if Worth dared her so big to write him a letter, she would take him up on it. He would be beat out. That's what he'd be. He would show off that letter to everybody he knew, but to himself he would puzzle now who had spelled it out so fine, and who had known how to fold it up, and write on the smooth side, so strangers would know where it had to go, and who was sharp enough to put on a couple licks of red sealing wax, so all the nosy men that passed it on couldn't open it up and wear it out reading it for themselves. Now where, Sayward asked herself, could she get a proper body to do this letter for her? Miss Covenhoven could spell like copper plate in the Low Dutch language, but Worth would have a hard time finding a Dutchman in the French settlements to make it out. Buckman Toll, they said, had a good handwrite, but Sayward wasn't asking any favor from the Tolls. George Roebuck neither. He would write it short to suit himself, if he was busy, and she would never know the difference. No, she wouldn't take it to him. Well, I didn't look for seein' that one here today. Miss Covenhoven spoke out suddenly. Sayward sat up, and her eyes beaded a little as she caught sight of Jake Tench, crossing the grove with Porteous Wheeler. It perked her up to see how close he looked like he had in her dream. When last she saw him, he was a dandy, and no mistake, in a ruffled shirt, and his young face shaved smooth as a Quaker's. Now he wore a tangled beard and woodsy breeches, and his Rorum hat looked woolly as the coonskin cap, with 3 brass rings she saw in her dream. Here, she told herself, might be a body to write her letter. Could anybody sharpen up a quill and make it scratch down sightly dabs and curly cues, it should be a Bay State lawyer. By this time, the woods were winking with pan flashes and echoing with small thunder. Those that had fowling pieces were shooting them off with as heavy charges as they durst. Powder smoke floated through the woods like a black fog. This was Independence Day for sure. Old Man Steffi marched around playing Who's Afraid on his fife like they played it at Bunker's Hill, and those that had seen soldier service stood up plenty straight, sniffing the black powder like war horses. It spited Sayward that Jenny wasn't here when they joined in singing, at places where the others held back. Jenny would have sailed on clear and true as a red bird. Buckman Toll and George Roebuck talked long and mighty earnest to the Bay State lawyer. Then Buckman quieted and addressed the crowd. We're lucky to have a speaker this Independence Day. I don't know as I need make you acquainted with him, but I'll call his name. It's Porteous Wheeler, Esquire, and he hails from Massachusetts State, the same as my sister and me. He and George Roebuck helped Porteous up on the butt of a big log, and Jake Tench grinned from ear to ear as he stood handy by to catch him if he swayed too far and fell off. But once the Bay State lawyer was up, he stood steady as a brown forest hawk watching from some high chestnut stub. Only a burning in those gray-green eyes showed the brandy. Across the clearing, Sayward saw the gaze of some Indian hangers, fixed on him like on a chief's face. Patriots, friends of the Republic, he began in a voice astonishingly deeper and stronger than his size. I see a few soldiers present. I judge it only fair to warn them, here his eye flashed around, that the subject of my oration will be hail to civil law, and death and damnation to military domination. Buckman Toll flushed up, and some of the older soldiers scrunched around on their logs or from one foot to the other, but Sayward felt a little tremor run through her. Oh, he was afraid of nothing. There he stood daring and double daring most all the men in the grove, for the biggest part of them had seen army service one way or another, and were prouder of it than a savage of his scalp stick. Some of the military say Porteous thundered, "Let's take Canada by arms, God forbid. If our American eagle wants to scream, let it scream over the fields forests and workshops of its own white and red peoples for civil equality and justice. Oh, he could fetch out things that made the hair tingle at the back of your neck before he got halfway through. Some were firing off their rifles and fouling pieces already to show that they were with him, and Jake Tench had stopped grinning and was yelling loud as anybody. Never had Sayward the chance to get a long look at Porteous Wheeler up to now, and today she looked her fill. Of all the humans in these woods, he was the strangest. What was he doing away back here where it had no call for loitering? He didn't tramp the woods to hunt or fish. He didn't give a lick to trade. All he asked, they said, was to be left by himself in his cabin of buckeye logs that were easiest for a greenhorn to cut to length, out near the fallen timbers. Once in a new moon, the bound boy told, he used to come down to George Roebuck's to ask for a letter that had never come. He didn't come any more, and what was to be in that letter, and whom it was to come from, not even George Roebuck knew. Some thought the solitary looked for money, and some for pardon of a crime done back in the Bay State that preyed on his mind like the killing of a brother. But most believed that if that letter ever dropped out of the furry cap of some Ohio settlement runner, it would come in a woman's handwrite, and this was Sayward's notion. Today, as she looked over his tangled young beard and woodsy breeches, and the bitter look in his eye, she thought that whoever that Bay State woman was, and whatever she might be like, with her fine rings, her store scents, and whalebone stays, it was time she sat down and wrote Porteous Wheeler his letter, and she better do it soon. What he said in the rest of his speech she didn't recollect, for thinking of him and her letter, but she minded his toast, speech-making done, they had all hunted logs for their dinner. The woman said the men hadn't done so bad with the meat. Anyhow, they had plenty for all, venison, bear flesh, turkey, and pigeons. Jake Tench went around with a jug for toast drinking. Sayward felt glad he didn't call on one of them. A Luckett would have hemmed and hawed and come out with some foolishment. But you could tell George Roebuck had done this before. Long corns and short toes to the enemies of the Republic, he called out, and the men whooped and whistled. Buckman Toll gave the shortest. The flag, he said. Most everybody yelled the hardest for that, especially the young ones, and Billy Harbison pulled on the rope till Old Glory and its 15 stars waved fit to kill. But Porteous Wheeler gave the best, Sayward thought. He held up his wooden bowl, and she reckoned how he looked like Captain Loudon, who lived in the brick mansion house between her grandmam's and Lancaster Town. Northwest Territory, he spoke, quiet as could be. May we love her as a wife, but our home state as a mother. Most of the grown-up faces went bleak at that, and plenty eyes watered as if here in these strange dark woods they could see for a minute the sunlight of those faraway places where they had been born. It was the middle of the afternoon before Jenny came. Sayward made them out first on the path, Louis ahead, and Jenny humble on behind, as a woman should. Sayward had been getting her dander up against Louis, But now she was so glad to see Jenny, she didn't hold it against him any more. She watched her lovingly as she came over where the married woman sat. Jenny gave her oldest sister shy greetings with her eyes. "You got here ahead of me," was all she said, and sat on the log beside her and let herself be stared at by two little girls going by, who stopped stock still like she was some white flower of the woods to look at. "You missed a good dinner, Jenny," Miss Covenhoven said. "I ain't a-hungry," Jenny murmured. "The days go so fast out are. Louie and me plumb forgot what day it was till noontime." Oh, Jenny would never complain it was Louie who wouldn't fetch her in, either here or to Sayward's cabin. No, when Wyatt went by out there with the cows, she would always call after him to tell Sayward they'd be in one of these here days, and never would she come. Sayward would go out, but if Louie wasn't home, as happened mostly, he claimed she came to carry tales behind his back. Once when Wyatt stopped off after such a time, Jenny tried to hide black and blue marks under her short gown. What all Louie had against her, Sayward wasn't certain, but it was plenty. He couldn't abide her, that she knew, and it didn't help any that he had to keep his woman's sister and family in meat. He wouldn't fetch it in the cabin any more, but hung it on a dogberry back where none could see him when he came. They'd find it when one would go behind the cabin to see. Bad as she needed the meat sometimes, Sayward felt like taking it out and throwing it back in his face. But that would make it all the harder for Jenny. The sisters didn't talk much today. It felt good just to sit side by each. After a fitting time, Sayward told her the news from Worth. Jenny didn't say anything. Her eyes were watching them clean off rotten logs for a dance ground. Her cowhide shoes tapped to the fast time of Old Man Steffi's fife and Billy Harbison's fiddle. Jake Tench came up and asked Sayward to jig one off with him. "Give the rest a chance at Jake," she said. What she wanted was somebody to ask Jenny. Heavens to Betsy, it was nothing out of the way for a man to jig or shuffle out in front of everybody, with some other man's woman. That gaunt woman from Kentucky gave her babe to one of her young ones, to hold and swung off with old Jude McWhirter, till her short gown blew out like hogshead hoops, and her black eyes glowed deep in her hollow sockets. Truth to tell, it had plenty who would like to ask Jenny, but they held back on account of Louie. Louie could fly up and get ugly over no reason at all. The bound boy stood around with his eyes bleeding on Jenny, and yet, even with Jake to back him, he didn't want bad feelings with Louie Scurra. Louie didn't take Jenny out either. The only one he reeled with was Asha. You don't many times see folks so brother and sister like. Idie Toll had to go and say, sweet as sap that has stood too long and started to work. Nobody said anything to that, for they hadn't need to. Asha hopped around with her sister's man as gaudy as a popinjay in her blue short gown. So that, Sayward thought, was why she had plagued for a kettle of Burr oak dye. Sayward had told her red would look better on a dark-complected body, like her, but Asha had said if Jenny could wear blue, she could too, so she could. Yes, any color would do for Asha so long as it was blue, like Jenny was married in. After a while, when Sayward looked around, her eyes couldn't light on Asha or Louis, either one. Wherever they went, they stayed a long time. Asha came back to the grove first from one side of the bush, and Louis some time after from the other. Sayward's face kept tolerable calm, but the set of her cheek-bones warned Idie Tull she better make no more cracks now. The day was at its short end when the frolic broke up. Those that had a long ways to go lit shellbark or candlewood at the coal pit, so they wouldn't have to make fire for light on the way home. Jenny caught sight of Louis waiting. He wouldn't come up where Sayward was, but stood off by himself with a touchy face. Jenny slipped down off her log. Well, I expect me and Louis'll have to skedaddle for home. Her eyes met Sayward's for a moment. When are you a-comin' in? Sayward asked for something pleasant to say. Oh, Louis'll fetch me in some time. I got the time. Why don't you come out? It's mighty nice out I sure like my cabin. Asha stood by hard as blacksmith nails, not saying anything. Wyatt had his shocked head down gravely. His eyes peered up like he was staring away, out through the dark woods, where his married sister had to go. Look for me out tomorry, if the cows come that-a-way. Jenny flashed back a radiant face. Goodbye to you, she called. Sayward said no word to Asha on the way home. When they got to the cabin, the fire was out, down under the ashes and all. The hearth felt stone cold. I won't make a fire till mornin', she told them shortly. You can go to bed in the dark. To herself she said she would like to take Asha out and beat some sense in her. But that would do little good all around. No, it would only dare Asha and double dare Louis. Some you could talk to. Asha would close up her face like a squaw. Even Worth couldn't get anything out of her then. Worth could be glad he was out in the French settlements, not knowing anything about this. Come to think on it, she guessed she wouldn't write him a letter after all. Let him go on thinking Jenny was still single, and things were all right in here. They didn't need anything, did they? No, they could make out. When she lay down in her lone bed, she recollected her dream. Yes, that was all over with. She would have no excuse for striking up acquaintance with Porteous Wheeler now. Well, it just went to show. She never had much for this telling fortunes anyhow.